Thanks so much. And hello, everyone. Good to be with you, at least in some sense, here through this medium. I look forward someday maybe to gathering together at Upaya or other places. But for now, this is really a wonderful opportunity for us to connect. What I'd like to do now is lead us in a bit of a practice. It's really going to be a kind of a few different practices and exercises. And part of what I'm going to try to do is introduce you to, or maybe let's say suggest a way of examining your own experience that will be useful for understanding what I want to speak about after this little practice session. So it'll be a little bit like we're going to go into what Francisco Varela used to call the laboratory between your ears, right? The phenomenological laboratory, so to speak. Okay, let's start by finding a comfortable position. Part of what that means is it's a position that is alert, but relaxed. So the spine should be straight, but flexible. A sense of stability with the feet flat on the floor if you're sitting in a chair. Just allowing the earth to uphold one. Naturally, gravity holds us. Mother Earth holds us naturally. Just let her do that. And simply sustain a posture of alertness and relaxation. A strong back and an open front. And then perhaps lifting the shoulders just to bring in the breath and exhale. Just to release a little. Let go. And at the beginning of this session, let's just bring to mind briefly why we're here, what our motivation might be for ourselves and others, whatever it might be. Just bring that to mind. And then letting go of thoughts, just allow the mind to settle on the sensations of breathing, perhaps at the abdomen. No need to figure anything out. There's no need to have high fidelity focus. Just let the mind naturally ride on the breath, with your eyes opened or closed as you wish. Thoughts arise, there's no need to chase after them. There's no need to anticipate the future or dwell on the past. Simply notice thoughts as thoughts, sensations as sensations, and let go. Like clouds passing in the sky, whatever it might be. There's an old saying, if you don't stir up the water, it will become clear. If you don't try to fix the mind, it will settle on its own. No need to fix anything. No need to make anything happen. Just aware and not lost. Now, as the mind is settling, I'd like to invite you to engage in a little exercise. Let's first open our eyes. Just notice as you open your eyes, again, as if with the same attitude, just relaxed. Notice how the eyes will naturally settle on some kind of an object. Might be something with high contrast, an edge or corner. Just allow the eyes to settle on something. Notice the depth of visual experience. A sense of something over there. With that sense of over there, there's also a sense of in here. A sense of looking. Ask yourself, who is looking? What is looking? Just raise the question, then let it go and let the eyes settle again. No need to turn inward. Not yet. And now, as if looking backward through your eyes, look in. And then let go of that. And settle. Again, ask who is looking. Keep the eyes on the object. And then again, bring the gaze in as if backward through the eyes. And settle. And now you can attend in whatever you wish. If you'd like to close your eyes again and settle on the breath, or continue with a visual object, whatever you like. Here's the next exercise. I'm going to make a sound. And I would like you to invite you to listen very carefully to this sound. Listen very carefully. And now to end this session, let's come back to the breath. Just settle. And expand the awareness, sense of the room you're in, sense of space, even while on the breath, sense of the body within space. And just now let go even of the breath. All right. Let's take whatever positive merit we've been accumulating through all of these practices and dedicate it to achieving our highest aspirations. So maybe we should take a short break, or should we go into the talk, Hiroshi? You're muted.
Myself, thank you. John, I think we'll proceed into the talk. Thank you.
That's good. It's actually that's best really, because what I'd like to do to begin, I'm going to be showing you a few images here and there, but I won't be using PowerPoint this time. And in fact, what I'd like to do is sort of set a certain kind of context, because actually context setting is part of what I want to talk about in a certain way when I talk about reflexivity and being conscious is being unconsciously connected. It's kind of a strange thing to say, maybe. So part of what I like about this context in the Varela Symposium, and I love how I can see Kalina is there, you know, in a virtual version of the Zendo, is how it's a kind of Buddhist context for me, so that I can wear my Buddhist philosopher or Buddhist theologian hat. So to do that, to set that context, I'm just going to do something very traditional, which is to invoke the lineage. So allow me to just do that very briefly. Vidutakampanajala Gambhinudara Murtaye Namaha Samantabhadraya Samantasparana Trishe Nabhavo Napyabhavo Sindhuchedanapi Shashvataha Nanityonapi Nityastvam Advayaya Namostute Om Chuki Yingi Bodhane Dusan Sange Kungi Ngoni Rasu Chukungun Tunze Batsavela Mishala Suvate Seren Kiki Kena Bersaki Jala Timo Mumbo Rabzane Kadan Tanjashon Topi Lojo Bobin Namajones. So this is there's a way in which in the Buddhist world we set a kind of context, and part of what I like about doing that is that it allows me to do kinds of things, you could say, that I wouldn't necessarily do in an academic context, which is maybe be a little more creative, you might say. So I'm going to try to convey to you some features of this idea of reflexive awareness, which is so important in the non-dual traditions of India and East Asia, Chan and Zen and Sion. But also I'm going to try to do something a little bit original, maybe, or a little different with it, which is to say that from kind of maybe playing from within this standpoint of Buddhist philosophy or even Buddhist theology, if you like, see how this can also apply to a social perspective on what it means to be conscious. And it's important to remember that the idea of the social is actually a relatively new idea in the world. It's not that there were not words for the social in many pre-modern societies, but there's a way of thinking about the social that really starts to emerge in the 19th century and gains a lot of traction in the 20th century with figures like Émile Durkheim, the famous French sociologist, who's often called le père de la sociologie, the father of sociology. So there's ways in which Buddhist philosophy, traditional Buddhist philosophy, doesn't really engage with the social in the way that we do now. So part of what I want to do is think a little bit about how we might make that connection, because I think there is implicitly some very important features about this nature of awareness, about the landscape of awareness, that very much can connect to some of our intuitions, but also some of our research and some of the latest work on the nature of the social. So let me begin by actually addressing this idea of what is this notion of reflexive awareness. And just so you know, this is a term that is originally coming from Sanskrit, as you can see it here, swa samvitti, in Sanskrit, or in Tibetan, rong rig. It's it's a widely used term, a very important term. And part of what it involves is a particular feature. It's the use of this term swa in Sanskrit, or in Tibetan would be rang. And what this means, what swa here means, is it's often translated as self-awareness, but actually that's a little bit kind of misleading. And that's why I don't use that translation of self-awareness. I use reflexive awareness, because what we're talking about here is actually a kind of awareness that is best described as actually intransitive awareness. And the way we get to that is by using what's called a reflexive pronoun. Unfortunately, we have many speakers of languages who totally can understand that here today. We have unfortunately don't speak Portuguese. I used to speak Spanish pretty well, studied Spanish many years. I'm fairly fluent in French. And in languages like those, you have reflexive pronouns. And these reflexive pronouns are actually the pronouns that are used, for example, to change a verb that is transitive into an intransitive verb. So for example, in Spanish, we can say, yo hablo español, right? I speak Spanish. Or we can say, se habla español, which we can't actually really translate into English. We have to do it as a passive, something like español es hablado, right? Spanish is spoken. That is how we would translate that in English. In French, I can say, je vois ça, I see that. Or I can say, ça se voit, as if it's that sees itself. That doesn't quite make sense, does it? In English. So what does that pronoun do? The se or the se in Spanish and French, for example, and I believe we have something very similar in Portuguese, is it takes a verb that's usually a transitive verb, which means that there is an agent. I speak Spanish. Yo hablo español. There's an agent engaging in an action on an object. So so that's a transitive action. And we take that verb, hablar, and we just use that reflexive pronoun, and now we have turned it into an intransitive verb. So that's what's going on in this term swa samviti in Sanskrit. Samviti means awareness. Usually awareness presents itself to us in terms of what we call subject-object intentionality. That sense of there being a kind of structure to awareness. And as Jay very helpfully pointed out, a lot of this for humans is visual awareness. It's kind of maybe our primary kind of way in which we engage in the world, the version of perception that we always come back to for an example. So when we are looking at something, there's a sense of that object of being over there, and at the same time, a sense of us, in a sense, being in here, some sense of kind of vague subjectivity. I love the quote that Richie showed from Francisco Varela about that vague sense of self. Somehow there's a sense of there being a seer or a looker inside who is in a sense looking out. So that's a structure of intentionality. That even happens with thoughts, so that when we think about an apple, it also will be presented with this sense of it being over there, being beheld by our vague sense of subjectivity. So when we talk about reflexive awareness, it is not that kind of knowing. It's not a kind of knowing that is, I am seeing that. If you go back, for example, to one of the exercises we just did a few minutes ago, as you were seeing the object, there was with that a sense of there being a seer in some sense. I believe you'd probably agree with that. Unfortunately, I can't see you all, and I don't think we have time to take a poll, but probably most of you will have this sense that, yes, like as I'm looking at that, as I'm looking at whatever object it is, I have a sense of that object is being seen from a perspective. So that there is a perspective in the visual field that is presented with the visual experience. And yet I am aware of that perspective. In a sense, I'm aware of there being a this end and that end. I can be aware of, this is the object, I'm knowing the object, and yet I'm also aware of this end, so to speak, but without making it an object. In fact, when we did the exercise of trying to turn in and look, probably for most of you, what happened, of course, is you tried to turn in and look and to see the seer, so to speak, and you can't see a seer because now you're on the other end trying to look in, right? I'm looking at the object and so I'm going to look in now, but now that same structure of subject-object duality, I've just turned it around this way. And now I'm trying to look at myself from the perspective, from another perspective. So I've just turned myself into an object. So that you can call introspection, but that is not reflexive awareness. So reflexive awareness is the ongoing presentation, for example, of their sense of there being a perspective, even while one is focused on the object. And this has some very important features to it. And I'm just curious, by the way, something to think about that maybe we can raise with the panelists or with all of you in discussion. Is there, in a sense, or would we say I am conscious of that subjectivity? Am I aware of that? Am I conscious of subjectivity? Am I conscious of that sense of the perspective? Or is this something I'm unconscious of? So one way of recognizing that or asking that question is to think about the time when we made the snap. So when I make a snap like that, I assume you remember hearing the snap. If I make a snap like that, I can ask you a question, for example, do you have a sense that you were the one that heard the snap, or was it somebody else? Again, do you feel I heard the snap? When you have a memory of recollecting the snap, am I the one that heard the snap, or did someone else? I think for many of us, that probably seems like an almost absurd question. Well, obviously, I mean, it seems incredibly, of course, I'm the one that heard the snap. How, is there any doubt? That sense of it being an experience that you had, right? So that's also that sense of there being that sense of subjectivity of the one who is listening, that's being presented intransitively through this reflexive awareness. Another way of talking about reflexive awareness is actually that it enables you to keep track of where you are in time and space. When you think of that event, does that event have a location? It's before, it's after yesterday, it's before tomorrow. A sense of it being located in time. If I make this sound now, do you have trouble keeping track of whether that sound happened just now or happened an hour ago? Are you able to, when I say I make a sound just now, and I ask you, were you sitting down when you heard the sound? Do you have to say to yourself, well, let's see, I was paying attention to the sound, so I don't know whether I was sitting down. So I'll have to do an inference. I'll have to, in a sense, in a way, kind of guess. I don't remember moving. I remember sitting down, and I don't remember moving. So I must have been sitting down when the sound happened. But of course, that doesn't seem to correspond to our experience. It seems that the memory of that event includes things like also not just our sense of being a subject, but our sense of being located in space and time, our sense of being the one, not just the sense of being the one that heard it, but also of being embodied, of, for example, sitting or standing or walking, even while we are focused on an object. So part of the claim here, and there are, of course, lots of philosophical arguments we could get into, and Jay and I could spend a lot of time in a detailed argument about all of this, but I'm afraid most of you would probably find that a little bit irrelevant at the moment. So we won't get into the philosophical details, but I do want to now explain, and hopefully that's fairly clear. What is it doing? It's presenting, again, our sense of being having a perspective, our sense of being located in space and time relative to sights and sounds, especially vision and auditory sensation. It's also what presents our sense of emotion, actually, our sense of there being some kind of a feeling that comes with our perception. I'll say more about that in a second. And you could say, in its larger sense, it kind of is what's presenting on this theory coming from the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti in particular. It's kind of presenting an entire context, or almost an entire world, that is the background of our experience, right? So you could say that when I'm looking at something, let's say I'm looking at a pen, as I'm looking at a pen, that's the object of my experience. But in order for me to engage with that object, there's so much more that I need to know that needs to be available to me in my experience, my body position, my orientation toward that object, when this is happening. All of that is being presented on this account by this intransitive form of knowing that's called reflexive awareness. You could say that when I'm looking at the pen, I'm knowing that it is a pen, but what reflexive awareness is presenting is how I know that, right? What is that experience like, if you want? How is it being presented? Not what is being presented, but how is it being presented? So let me say something a little bit about why this is important in Buddhism. And one of the ways this is very important is that we start out with the idea here that emerges in what's called Yogacara philosophy, that the basic form of primal confusion, is basically subject-object intentionality, the duality formed by subject and object, the sense of there being a self in here and an object out there. And this is, you could say, well, what is it good for? Why would it have emerged? If we think in evolutionary terms, why would we have evolved to have this subject-object duality? Well, it's precisely because it enables us, for example, to track ourselves in space and time relative to objects. Most importantly, it enables us to get what we need or what we want, affordances, and to avoid dangers. So the Buddhist perspective, which aligns pretty well with an evolutionary perspective, is that all that our, you could say that our behaviors are caught up in samsaric survival in samsara, survival in the world of suffering, so to speak. And our cognitive systems are operating precisely for the purpose of getting stuff that we want and avoiding the stuff that we don't want. And the Buddhist perspective, you could say that one of the earliest insights in Buddhism is that this is kind of maladaptive from an evolutionary perspective. In other words, if we think of this in terms of evolutionary science, it may be useful for survival, but in humans in particular, it has evolved in a particular way that causes lots of problems. And one of the main problems, not the only one, but one of the main problems it causes, it gives us the illusion of there being some kind of a self that is in control, that is in charge, that is unchanging over time, that is the perceiver of perceptions. But the Buddhist claim is that this sense of there being a subject out there and an object an object out there and a subject in here, that actually is an illusion. It is not real. It is a kind of defect in cognition that may be useful for survival, but also creates many problems, like that false sense of self. And it's a particular kind of illusion that in the Buddhist context will be called a non-conceptual illusion. What that means is, it's not a matter of, for example, you see a rope late at night, you're in a place where there are a lot of snakes, and you go, oh, that's a snake. And then you look a little more carefully and you realize, oh, I just mislabeled that. It's a rope. I just wasn't paying enough attention. But there are other kinds of errors that you can't correct just by knowing what's really the case. So let me show you an example of that kind of error. This is a famous one called the Knizz's triangle. So when you look at this, for most people, if you're sighted and you're looking at this image on the screen, what you see is a triangle. A triangle emerges to you. It looks like there are edges that form a white triangle. But actually, there are no edges. There are no lines there. Your visual system is doing that as a result of certain properties of the visual system. Knowing that there is no triangle there does not make the triangle go away. This is very important. Knowing that there is no triangle there, that there are no lines, does not make that white triangle go away. You have to do something more, if you can even do it. So the subject-object duality is like that kind of illusion. It is an illusion that we can know is false, but nevertheless persists. It remains even when we know intellectually that it's false. So it cannot be eliminated, therefore, by doing more intellectual work on this account. One way of talking about this in the Tibetan traditions is that you can't get rid of grasping with more grasping. Dzimbe dzimpa mi pang. In other words, this structure, subject-object duality, is actually the basis for thinking. It's the way in which we think, the way in which we use reasoning requires that structure. Because the claim is that our conceptual system has developed for the purpose, again, of being an agent acting in the world, of getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want. And because our system operates in that way, has developed in that way, all of our conceptual structures also are caught up in that same kind of duality. I, as an agent, as an actor, am going to get something or avoid something in the world. So that means that that structure, that thinking actually is always going to be caught in that structure. Reasoning is always going to be caught in that structure. That also means that every attempt to do something, right, to get something or avoid something or to make something is also going to be caught in that structure, right? Whatever, if we try to, for example, we say, well, the way we're going to actually eliminate this problem is we're going to have an experience in which that structure disappears, right? We can't do it just by thinking. We actually have to have an experience. The idea here, and this is very important in Buddhist notions of how we change and transform ourselves, we need more than intellectual understanding. We actually have to have an experience that counteracts our confusion or our delusion. So the kind of experience we're talking about would be an experience in which this structure of subject and object collapses. But if you have to make that happen, if you have to make an effort to make that happen, if you have to do something to make that happen, then you won't be able to do it, because doing is always going to be dualistic. So the only way to make that happen is, in a sense, to not make it happen. You don't do something, you let go. So part of what that means, therefore, is when you let go, what's going to happen, so to speak? Let's say we somehow use meditative techniques, and I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. We use some meditative techniques or some other methods I'll mention, and that structure collapses, right? What has to be the case? First, we have to remain conscious. So if that structure collapses and I'm not aware anymore, I'm not going to learn anything from it other than, oh, I basically, ceased. I'm not going to consciously learn something. I might get some kind of other conditioning, of course, but I'm not going to have conscious access, which is going to be important, as I will explain. I'm not going to have conscious access to that experience. It's just going to be a blackout. So just as we wake up in the morning and there's a sense of being aware or being conscious, maybe very fuzzy in the beginning, even at that time, maybe that structure is a little bit weaker, but we have a sense of not being asleep, right? That's what something, at least at that level, needs to persist. A sense that I am awake. I am not unconscious, right? That is what needs to persist in order for it to have the therapeutic effect of that kind of a moment of experience of the collapse of subject-object duality. That therapeutic effect is available from the Buddhist perspective, requires us to still be conscious. Since we have to still be conscious, and since we can't make non-dual consciousness, because if we have to make it, then we're going to be caught in duality, caught in effort. It has to be, in Sanskrit, anabhoga, effortless. So our experience has to be this non-dual awareness has to be something that is already present in our experience. We don't have to fabricate it. It has to be an innate feature of our conscious experience. And that innate feature is exactly this intransitive awareness or reflexive awareness. Because, of course, even while I'm looking at an object like this pen, I have, again, the claim here is, and we won't go into the arguments, but the claim here is, and maybe in your own experience, you can see this, that even while you look at the object, you have a sense of being the one looking. And so if I ask you right now, do you feel like you're looking at it, or is it somebody else? Of course, there are some disturbances of consciousness in some forms of schizophrenia, for example, in which persons lose track of that sense. But for most of us, this seems like obvious. Of course, I am the one that's looking at it. What a silly question. But that sense of being the one looking at it, you don't know that as an object. It's presented with the experience, so that when you remember the experience, you remember that perspective, but you didn't have to turn inward. If I say to you now, are you the one looking at it? Do you have to turn inward and see, wait, let me check if it's me or somebody else. 1 second, I'm just going to look inside. And is that what we have to do? I don't think so. So that's the point here, that this is being presented along with our experience. And so that sense of subjectivity is being presented intransitively, which means that it's being presented not as an object. Therefore, there's an aspect even of the dualistic awareness of seeing an object that is already non-dual. There's an aspect of seeing an object that is already non-dual. And that aspect is the aspect that is presenting the sense of being the one seeing. But of course, this sense is false, right? From the Buddhist perspective, this separation between self and world is a false separation. So again, and how are we going to overcome, but it's so real to us, just like the triangle that we saw. It's so real to us. And I was just listening to an account of a schizophrenic man. He says, I know there's no person in the back seat about to attack me as I'm driving the car. And I've learned to really hold on to those beliefs, but I still feel like he's there, right? It's the same thing here. How would I actually transform myself? Just thinking is not enough. I have to have an experience in which that collapses. So in Buddhist practice, there are various styles of practice in the non-dual traditions that try to make this happen. And I also think, and I was very interested to hear from Kalina about the use of psychedelics, that also seems to be a route here as well. Although we should talk about some of those details, because it's not, it's a little, let's just say it's got some problems, as with most of such things. Let me move on now. I want to talk a little bit about meta-awareness, and then now that perhaps we have some understanding of this idea of reflexivity, and then transition into the question of the kind of social. So very briefly, I think one of the things that we're coming to a consensus to in this group is that meta-awareness is actually more complicated than the one single term suggests. There are really many different forms of meta-awareness. The relationship between interoception and meta-awareness is important. And probably as we work more on this issue, we're going to start to decompose meta-awareness into maybe many more primitive concepts or constructs. But we can make this basic distinction that we did in our recent article that Jonathan Schooler also mentioned, a basic distinction between what we could call a kind of explicit meta-awareness that involves, it occurs at a particular moment, and that involves me saying, for example, oh, I am distracted, right? Or, oh, I have been daydreaming. But in order for that to happen, one hypothesis is that certain styles of meditation practice are cultivating something, and the Sanskrit term here is samprajanya, right? Which we can translate as meta-awareness. That meditation practices are cultivating a capacity that is not about a meta-awareness that is making a judgment at a specific time. Instead, it's about an ongoing background monitoring that has a phenomenal feel to it. In other words, even while I am, for example, watching my breath, I am sustaining an awareness of things like my body position, but also I'm sustaining awareness of the quality of that moment of awareness. So for example, this is what then hypothetically might enable us to explain how it is we get that explicit moment of meta-awareness. And the way we get it is that it builds on an implicit ongoing meta-awareness. So that there's a background. So one way of thinking about this, by the way, is as we are sitting here and you're listening to things, if something pops up in your visual field or a loud sound occurs, you'll pay attention, especially a loud sound. It becomes salient, it's important, because it might be a threat, for example. So but all the time, visual information, auditory information is coming in. We're not paying attention to that. It's not salient, it's not important. So likewise, you could say there's another kind of channel, which is not one of our five senses, but this kind of monitoring channel, if you like, that is also in a similar ongoing way, constantly presenting, and this I think is where interoception is almost certainly very important, constantly presenting information, and then under the right conditions, it becomes salient and we notice. So for example, let's say we're having a conversation, maybe Jay and I are having one of our debates, and this has never happened, but you know, maybe I'm getting a little worked up, and and I, you know, I could like keep going and then maybe win. You know, who knows? Jay's a tough opponent, but you know, maybe I win, but now I've lost a friend because I was so worked up and focused on the object, which is the debate itself, that I did not notice that my emotional state. But if my meta-awareness channel, so to speak, has been cultivated a little bit, and as part of my kind of ongoing task set, ongoing set of things that's important to me, keeping track of my emotions is also important to me, then in the middle of this debate, that channel is going to say, hey, okay, you're starting to get a little bit, you know, too hepped up. And then we follow Roshi's advice of down regulate. I think one of the first things she ever said to me, down regulate. So part of what that means then is that there's a kind of meta-awareness, which really is very similar to this idea of reflexivity, that even while we're engaged, without making an explicit judgment, is presenting all kinds of information to us about how we are experiencing, not what. So while I'm seeing something, my sense of emotion, even my kind of intuitions, or this idea of there being something on the tip of my tongue. Jonathan Schooler likes to talk about the Zeigarnik effect, and maybe we can talk about that at some point. This is also connected to what William James called fringe consciousness. In other words, in a sense, there's a kind of whole background that is being presented to me that enables my whatever I'm focusing on to make sense. In a way, you could say, I have to kind of hold an entire world in place in order for my cognitions of objects to make sense. Not just to make sense, this is a pen, but to make sense in terms of being relevant to my motivations, to my desires. Is it something I want or something I don't want, right? Without it being, in a sense, encoded affectively this way, that knowledge is useless and won't even occur. On the Buddhist standpoint, we don't even conceptualize the stuff that doesn't matter to us. So when we think about it in those terms, we can then ask ourselves, well, what else are we holding in place, so to speak, that makes as we're focusing on objects, there's a whole kind of our location in time and space, our various motivations as they are indicated by our emotional states, our sense of our perspective, so many things that are being held in place. But as humans, what else is being held in place that's critically important is actually other humans. So this is something that we don't get really in the Buddhist world, but this emerges from, there's lots of recent work on the way in which humans have evolved to be cooperators. So you could say in a certain way what it means to be a human is that you are a good cooperator, at least with somebody, right? Our ancient ancestors, as they evolved the capacity not to individually take down a woolly mammoth, a huge beast, but to do that as a group. And they developed a capacity for cooperation, and we find this is articulated. I especially like Michael Tomasello's way of talking about this, but there are many other accounts of this development, the evolution of the capacity for cooperation. This kind of cooperation is unlike the cooperation we see in other species. So for example, humans can cooperate with non-kin, people that they're completely unrelated to genetically. They can also cooperate in ways that are not determined by any kind of instinctual behaviors. They can do completely unexpected things like fly to the moon. I do not believe that flying to the moon is genetically encoded into our genome, as far as I know. So this capacity for incredibly complex and flexible cooperation with non-kin means in part that part of what we're keeping track of is precisely, in a sense, our connection to other people. So when a band of humans is engaged in a cooperative task, let's say even playing a game, like football, what we call soccer, in order for us to play that game together, as we are on the field, we have what in sports is sometimes called field sense, which is this sense of being that you know who's doing what. What are the different positions? What are the roles of those different positions? You can change your position if you had to. The forward can become a midfielder. The midfielder can become a defenseman. All of that, in a sense, is being maintained in the kind of world that is the social world of the individual who is cooperating with all of these other individuals. So one way of thinking about this kind of reflexive meta-awareness that's presenting to us an entire background of our experience is that it's presenting our experience as connected to other humans, that we have evolved that way. And there's some really interesting experimental evidence to support this. So one of these is actually, you could say that the human mind-body system has evolved to expect the presence of other humans. And actually, when other humans aren't around, it kind of freaks out a little bit. So there's some great work by Dennis Proffitt at University of Virginia on the effort required to carry a heavy backpack up a hill. And what he found is that when you asked people how hard this would be on their own, and then they just had a friend stand nearby, there were significant differences in the rating of the difficulty. When you look at a hill or just a picture of a hill, and estimate how hard this will be. You have a heavy backpack on. You give a much more difficult rating than if your friend is just standing nearby. They're not holding the backpack for you. They just make it feel easier. Jim Cohn, with his social baseline theory, has done some really interesting work that even brings us down to the level of the immune system. So that when we feel social support, in the presence of social support, we have a less intense immune response, basically a lower inflammatory response, than when we feel like connected to other people. And this, of course, is one of the great challenges of this time of COVID, is that we have to be physically distant. And I think Richie was saying to me, and also I think you mentioned today, right? It's not social distancing, it's physical distancing. Hopefully it's socially coming closer, right? Because that's really tough for us humans. To be socially distant is actually, in a sense, a kind of death sentence, right? If our ancient ancestor in the plains of Africa is in a group of humans and they say, sorry, we don't like you anymore, you have to go now, that moment of social exclusion is literally a death sentence, because it's not like that person, that early human can walk somewhere and get to another band of humans. They're dead. So social exclusion now, even for us now, really feels like a terrible thing to experience. It's one of the worst feelings for humans, one of the strongest dangers of being socially excluded. So connection is very much how we've evolved to connect. The last thing I'll say, though, is that not only you could say, so we see this, humans actually have developed practices that enhance these kinds of connection. A lot of them are ritual or ritual-like. And one of the ways experimentally that this seems to happen is, and also at a physiological level, including, for example, heart rate dynamics, is by moving together, singing together, chanting together, playing the drum together. I saw a recent study of drumming and heart rate dynamics. So it happens actually in our bodies, it appears, that we actually, especially under certain kinds of conditions, we really start to connect, like physiologically. But we also have a capacity that's not just about a kind of small group of humans. We have a capacity to cooperate that's at a much larger scale. And this seems to be a matter not just of genetic evolution, but actually of cultural evolution. And those of you that have read the book by Harari called Sapiens, he has it's a very straightforward account, but has a pretty good account of this model, which again, predates that work, but is also being developed further. And this is one way of thinking about this also is actually very relevant to metacognition itself. I just want to point out this has just come out. I don't know if any of you have seen this yet in Trends in Cognitive Science, Knowing Ourselves Together, the Cultural Origins of Metacognition. Really interesting piece that is pointing to the role of the social in something that is relevant to meta-awareness. One way of thinking about, holding, in a sense, and almost effortlessly, right? In a sense that we're not making an effort to hold this whole background. We don't understand ourselves to be holding this background. Part of the reason we get Zoom fatigue, by the way, is that we're trying to hold that background in this weird place where all of those other signals we usually get, the physiological signals, are not present. But we also are holding a fictional world together that enables us to collaborate at a very high level. So that, as Sarah Hrdy put it, if you took 100 chimpanzees, walked them down a jet bridge and had them board a plane, 100 chimpanzees who are unrelated and have never met each other before, there'd be blood everywhere, right? But you take I love this at the beginning of her book, Mothers and Others, which is very relevant to this discussion, right? The chimpanzees would just fight. You take 100 humans, never met before, and they're not kin, they're not related to each other. Not only do they not fight, they know what to do. And if they've never done it before, they just observe the other humans. You know, here's the line, you go this way. Oh, okay, now we go here, we wait, we put our bag up, right? Even if they can't seem to speak the same language, they can manage to do this. There are all these kinds of things that we can do because we share, in a sense, a kind of larger reality and a set of expectations. And that's what's key here. This idea of what you might call priors, a set of expectations that is driving our cognition that is essentially like a narrative universe that we're living in. And as Harari and others have pointed out, it's a fiction. Like the idea of, Jay was saying, money is totally a fiction. But that's an example of that kind of reality that we are constantly holding together, a social reality that's in the background that makes sense of our cognitions and our experiences. Our sense of being a member of a nation, it's completely fictional, actually. Our sense of having a particular kind of life narrative, like, oh, I start out in a particular way and I'm going to, maybe get married and have kids and have a job and so on. Especially we see this in young people where these narratives can become very dysfunctional. That also it's a fiction. But those narratives are constrained by the particular version of the story. So what I want to end on now is precisely this idea that part of what, if we can essentially become trapped in those worlds. And those worlds, we are all living in those worlds. There may be a sense that I'm an individual, but I'm speaking English and I didn't make up English, right? I learned English at a very young age. I learned all kinds of things at a very young age that are constituting that kind of narrative world, that universe that I inhabit, that social universe that I'm inhabiting. And if that particular version that I have culturally inherited, and here culture could be at the family level, could be at the community level, could be at that much larger scale level, that my cultural inheritance could actually be very destructive for me. I could develop a very negative sense of my own, who I am, and a sense of the incapacity to change, a sense of hopelessness, right? And that world constrains the way I can think. It's a little bit like, if I tell a story in the Tolkien universe, I can talk about hobbits and so on, but, I can't talk about starships. That's not a possibility in that universe. If I have a very profound depression, I can't even tell the story of myself being happy. I'm locked in the story of my own unhappiness, at least in some forms of depression. So this then brings another really key aspect that I think is very important for COVID, for this time of the pandemic, is the capacity, the potential for change here is very much also about letting go of what we think the true story is. Like the way the world is supposed to be, that there's a real way the world is. Because that is precisely what will prevent us from changing, make it impossible for us to transform ourselves. On an individual level, what we see, for example, is the tremendous capacity for a single dose of psilocybin, and we're doing research on this here, to have very profound effects for several months for people who have treatment-resistant depression. One way of thinking about this, as Robin Carhart Harris has put it, is it's like hitting a reset button, and suddenly the story is wiped out, right? That whole universe is wiped out. Even its subject-object is wiped out, right? That sense of ego dissolution that Kalina was talking about occurs, and yet the person is still aware, still conscious. And by being conscious at that time, that enables them then to create a memory that they can use to tell a different story. They know, oh, that story went away. It's not a fixed reality. Maybe there's a new story to tell in what's called the integration session. So that, I think, is one of the key aspects of how the non-dual, really a non-dual experience, not talking about becoming a Buddha, we're just talking about having a kind of non-dual experience that's structured in a particular way that gives us an opportunity to retell the story of ourselves and our world. Thank you.
John, thank you so very much. As always, clear, thoughtful, insightful. I wanted to start off, and we'll have some questions from the faculty, and I'll try to summarize some that have been coming in on the Q&A as you've been talking. But there are a number of individuals who are participating who come from clinical backgrounds where, particularly as they read the contemplative clinical literature, are familiar with terms like derealization and decentering. And I know you've written about this in your 2019 paper with Evan and with Jonathan. So I wonder if you might make a little bit more explicit how those connect with this notion of reflexivity and non-duality, and how all of that relates to meta-awareness.
So yes, Al, it's a great kind of bundle of things to talk about. Let me just say that to clarify, so reflexivity is this kind of very basic intransitive feature of consciousness that enables us to present basically off-object features as aspects of what that constitute awareness and that we feel are phenomenally accessible without them being known as objects. And then there's in that paper we hypothesize the idea of this kind of implicit meta-awareness, right? A meta-awareness, maybe I should quickly just show that paper. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that paper, but this one here, kind of meta-awareness that's sustained. It's not just intermittent, and it's non-propositional, meaning it's not really a judgment. And you could speak of this as being, in some sense, more implicit. So that seems to build on reflexivity, and then rather that implicit meta-awareness could perhaps, at least in some context, be understood as the basis for reaches a certain point of salience, and then you have an explicit judgment where you do an introspection, you look inward and you make a judgment about yourself. So all of that, here I had to disagree with Richie actually, because, and I know he's not here, is that his grandson's birthday, so can't defend himself. But that kind of, both the implicit and explicit meta-awareness can actually be dysfunctional. And I think one of the places where that's dysfunctional is possibly, I was just thinking about this when Kalina was talking about rumination. I think it was Kalina, that, one feature, clinical feature of some forms of rumination, maybe all, I'm not sure, is that as it's happening, the person is fully aware that they're ruminating and they really don't like it, right? Like, oh, I'm thinking about this again and again and again. That's a very common feature of rumination, but also interestingly of anxiety. So if we think especially that there's some connection between this kind of meta-awareness and interoception, a kind of hypervigilance about, my interoceptive channel, as it were, can actually be a trigger for anxiety and is a feature of at least some forms of generalized anxiety. So meta-awareness on its own, and correct me if I'm wrong about all that, but meta-awareness on its own is key, but you also need another feature that prevents what we can call cognitive fusion, which means, and this in a sense is what I was talking about at the end. So if I think my social reality is the way things are supposed to be, this is true reality, or for example, even a kind of hyper patriotism. I mean, on this account, the United States is an idea. It's not like a real thing in the world, right? It's a conceptual construct. It's a useful fiction. But if I'm taking that and turning it into a truly real entity, then that kind of fixation is going to have certain behavioral outcomes. And on the other hand, I can have an idea and then understand it to be a useful idea, but experience it even emotionally as, fictional at some level. It's not completely, truly real. And that, when we go really strongly into that standpoint, that's what's called, I prefer the term dereification, which is a little clearer than decentering. To reify is to make something real. To de-reify is to make it unreal. So clinically, we see that when we get caught up in our thoughts, if I'm thinking about a difficult conversation, and I take that with a lot of cognitive fusion, so I think it's real, it's going to cause a stress reaction in me. Whereas if I just see that as a thought, then that will dissipate its capacity to cause a stress reaction. So really, especially in the non-dual styles of practice, what you find is meta-awareness and de-reification really seem to kind of go together. That as we become more and more aware of not just our thoughts, but also our sensations and so on, we also see that, what we're thinking is not the reality. The thought of an apple is not an apple.
Thank you, John. Very helpful.
Gracias, John. Muy útil.
Oh, we had a little.
Sí.
We've got a little coming into the English language
Spanish
channel from one of the translators.
Portugués, no sé.
Yeah. Speaking of the translation, a quick apology to all of our Spanish speakers. We lost our Spanish translation for a little bit. There's what Gustavo describes as a brutal storm in Madrid, and the internet connection was compromised, but things should be back on track again. So again, apologies for that. Let's go to Wendy Hassenkamp, who had something she was going to say. Wendy?
Thanks, Al. Yeah, John, thanks so much for that great talk. I love this idea of, shining a light on this background awareness and also linking it to the social context. I think that's a really important and kind of a newer idea in there. I wanted to just raise a point and ask you your thoughts on this last point you were making about these fictional narratives, and you were just unpacking that a little bit more about how we agree upon these concepts, but they aren't real in reality, like nations. You can make the same argument for something like race. But then, of course, as you also began to say, these things then become instantiated in behaviors and in structures and systems and policies, and then that perpetuates further behaviors. So then they are very real. They become very real. So I was just wanted to see what you thought about that difference between the way that these can be fictional but also have very real world consequences.
Delusions are real to the people having them, and they therefore cause behaviors in those people. But that doesn't make them, if I believe that there are Martians living in my basement, that can have, and I'm completely convinced of that, that can have a very profound impact on my behavior. And maybe it leads me to build, Martian protection units all around the house. But, and so, yeah, there will be outcomes, but that doesn't make the Martians real. So that's what I think is very important, is to understand that distinction. So sometimes when we talk about, the system, the system is very much dependent upon this kind of fabrication, to use Jay's term. But of course, it can come with then physical, implementation. It comes with behaviors that people learn and acquire, and all of this is being, is a cultural heritage. And when we talk about the inheritance of these beliefs and the behaviors that go with them, and the cultural norms is really what we're talking about here, that go with them, they also really are operating at the biological level, right? So that because a lot of this is happening at a very young age, so that we are, the brain as it's developing in its plasticity is actually, in a sense, also physically manifesting these beliefs. So in that sense, we could also say, yeah, there's like a concreteness to them. But that doesn't make the actual, me being completely convinced that hobbits are real doesn't make them real. And that's kind of the key. And and thank goodness, because that means that I could maybe have an experience in which, in which I, at a visceral level, understand that that belief is false. That's kind of the perspective here. Now if I can have that experience because hobbits really are real, then, well, okay, then we got to deal with hobbits. Does that answer your question adequately?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful distinctions.
Yeah, and what I think is that there are all these systems, there are behaviors, there are like physical structures, there are norms, and those are, we treat them as actual reality, but the place where they're real is in our minds. That's the point.
Right.
Thank you. Jonathan Schooler had a question for you. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, John. I kept, as you're speaking, I said, gee, we really ought to collaborate. And I'm like, oh, wait, we have. But we should continue to. And there are all sorts of sort of in the trenches questions that I could imagine asking you, but I'd like to ask you a little bit of a bigger picture one that's always been a challenge for me. You were talking about sort of the self as an illusion, and that therefore even trying to recognize that illusion is problematic, because to try is an exertion of the self, at least as I understood it. And so the question is, whereas in Richie's talk, he was talking about we all in sort of facing the major crises that the world is facing right now, we just all have to really try really hard. So the question is, how do we reconcile or integrate this notion of the self as an illusion with sort of mustering the self wherewithal to really take on strong challenges? So how do you try without trying in this context of the self as an illusion?
That's really great, Jonathan. And I think one of the best ways to think about this is actually a distinction in the Tibetan tradition is called the Nyamje distinction, the distinction between Nyamshak and Jetop, the state of absorption and the state sort of once you get off the cushion, so to speak. So the idea here is that, we're trying, but what we're trying, and I'm trying to remember that quote that was from Richie, like Francisco Varela said, each group is sold on a particular way of doing things. Like, we want to we think our cultural norms are not contingent, they're reality. And by the way, everyone should have them. And so at some time, because they're reality, at some point, in human evolution, really believing the reality of your cultural norms was super useful because it enabled the emergence of large-scale societies. But then those large-scale societies start to interact more and more and more, and now they're like completely, interacting. And not only that, we are kind of making sub-societies on the internet, so that we have like multiple competing realities in coming into constant clashing, right? And they're all real for those people. Like, they're not norms, they're not contingent. So the idea of being on the cushion is the experience of the contingency of that reality. Like, the way in which I think the world is supposed to be is not the reality of the world. That is an experience that's best facilitated by, I think, a meditative experience, because it's a non-dual one maybe, but other styles too, because it's kind of controlled. But again, psychedelics may be a pathway to that as well. And certainly people report that kind of thing, that suddenly like, wow, I was so locked into my world and now I'm not, at least for a little while. So that's one. But then you get off the cushion and you say, well, even though my norms are not reality, I still would like the world to be a particular kind of way. Maybe I can be, now that I know they're not reality, maybe I'm more flexible and I can actually learn from other sets of norms, or I can make adjustments in my cultural norms. I'm more ready to, even though they have colonized my brain literally, maybe I'm more willing to make some, to really make some effort off the cushion to actually change some of that, to, you know, really engage my plasticity, so to speak. And so it's really, but the idea here then is that this moment, and this is also in Tantric Buddhism, like when you engage in Tantric meditation, part of what you're doing is you're actually building a palace that is, you know, like the paradise. But the first moment of that meditative practice is the dissolution of the whole world into emptiness. So that's, I think, a kind of key aspect of it is we need those experiences that show us the contingency of what we think is real, of our norms. I'm not even talking about, you know, like the kind of stuff Jay and I could get into, like, are your perceptual objects are real or not? I just mean like the sense, you know, like you're supposed to blow your nose into a handkerchief and not on the street. Like just things that disgust us, you know, and we think, oh, that's disgusting, but that's just a norm. They don't feel that way, as Durkheim kind of brilliantly pointed out long ago. So we can have a motivation, but now the motivation is actually much more flexible. It's has the capacity for transformation built into it, so to speak. And maybe it's also a little bit more relaxed and less like clingy and kind of fixated. But don't ask me, you know, I'm just talking head on a screen right now.
Thank you, John. Jay Garfield also had something he wanted to say, but right before we go to Jay, because it follows on to what you were just talking about, what you just said has obvious implications for racial conflict, for political conflict. And these questions have come up several times in the Q&A during your talk. What's the possibility for the kinds of practices that you've pointed toward to be scalable and able to address some of these things on a much broader and cultural level?
I think that's where potentially the kinds of trainings we have in the Healthy Minds program which is like infinitely scalable, may be helpful here. You know, what Matt Hirschberg is a postdoc here at the Center for Healthy Minds I've been working with, and he's got I think it's already out, this publication, where he did a kind of modified mindfulness style practice that influenced by our Healthy Minds program for pre-service teachers, and showed a significant decrease in implicit bias that lasted, if I remember, like several months. So that there was a really significant impact on that kind of practice, which I think in part is starting to get to. I mean, there are definitely styles of mindfulness. I think John Kabat-Zinn's been online here a little bit, listening from what he tells me, and you know, you can certainly see where there are ways of doing mindfulness that definitely can drop one into that sort of non-dual moment. And again, the contingency of that, and especially if you do that while you're kind of raising the question of race, the experiencing that as contingent, even just a little bit, may have a behavioral impact on things like implicit bias, even though, and we see some evidence of that, even though, you know, these things are really hard to do. But I think but it's really, so you could have practices that may be scalable, but the other thing I'll just say is that, you know, it's not like if that doesn't work, then it's the end of the story. Even just a little bit of contingency, like I know, for example, that the Kinesis triangle is not a triangle. Maybe I could even induce an experience in which it goes away for a little while, that, you know, the white triangle that seems to be there. And then I know, as I'm going around, I see the triangle, but I know it's not real. And that could have an effect on my behavior. And now here we're not talking about triangles, but we're talking about bias, right? Where this would first of all make me more meta-aware of bias, one hopes. And then also, but also then see it like as a problem, as contingent, as an illusion. And that could have an effect on my behavior too. I remember Jay gave a paper on this a while ago. That was a really good paper. That came out in the Shantideva volume, Jay?
It's there, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Jay, why don't we go ahead with you and what you had wanted to have to say?
Sure. First, thank you very much, John. That was a lovely talk. I did jokingly say to John yesterday, the only things we disagree about are the important things. But actually, I think that this is a talk in which all of the important things are the things we agree about, and the places where the disagreements are there. They're fun to debate, but they're technical. And I'm not going to worry about those. What I wanted to do was to underline a few things that you said and to maybe just reinforce some of those insights, and you can take them as friendly amendments or as you like. One, and this really came up as a response to Wendy's intervention. It's kind of fun to recognize that in English, the words fact and fiction are cognate. Both come from Fingare. And in 17th century, 18th century English, so if you're reading Hume, for instance, as I spend a lot of my time doing, you recognize that they're being used in a very close way. And so when we think about a factory, this gets back to fabrication too. A factory is someplace where we make things. And a fiction, the initial use of the word fiction in English is something we made. And so it's nice to remember that facts too, like things we make in factories, are things we make. And one of the challenging dualities that we're called upon to erase is the duality between fact and fiction.
Yeah.
To be careful with that.
Point. Can I jump in there for a sec, Jay? Just say, in other words, what you're saying is we can never be free of the perspective that's producing the facts. Like it's always,
and so there's always an element of fiction. And the beautiful thing to remember, though, is that doesn't undermine truth. Chandrakirti emphasized, and as Tsongkhapa emphasizes with great power, within the domain of fiction, we can still distinguish truth from falsity. It's true that Ahab captained the Pequod and false that Queequeg did. And that's within the fiction, but it's truth and falsity within fiction. And so we can still reconstruct, recognizing the fictional character of our world, robust senses of truth and falsity. And so that's important. But I really wanted to pick up with your use of the word samprajanya. And this takes us back to Shantideva, where that word figures so prominently in the 5th chapter. And to underscore something that you said, samprajanya isn't just awareness of what's happening at the present moment, but it's also, and when we think about it ethically, and when Shantideva is thinking about it, samprajanya requires me this idea, you called it meta-awareness. I tend to think of it as introspective vigilance or something like that, but also is a kind of recollection. It's making me make sure that I'm remembering my vows. I'm remembering my commitments. I'm remembering who I am, what's important to me, to whom I'm connected. So that idea of samprajanya, which we think of as so self-focused, is really a focus on how I fit into the bigger picture and why that bigger picture is important to what I do. And that led me to be thinking about something else that you said that I also wanted to underscore, connect to a slightly different issue. And that was, you said, I learned these things when I'm very, very young. And so that brings me to one of my favorite contemporary developmental psychologists, Vasudevi Reddy, and all of the work that she has done to demonstrate how first-person consciousness is dependent on second-person consciousness. That we don't first think of ourselves and then discover there are other minds and other people. We first think of those around us, and we recognize ourselves as one of them. And the early 20th century Indian philosopher Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya put this very beautifully in his book on subjectivity. Where he said, when we think about the first person pronoun, I, we only use it when we're addressing somebody else. And we can only use it in address. So whenever we think I, we're thinking I for a presupposed you. And then points out that, but the only way we can use that meaningfully is to presuppose a host of third persons, the people who constitute the conventions and the customs that make language meaningful in the first place. So first person presupposes second person presupposes third person.
Community, yeah.
And who we are, who I am, presupposes who we are. And that's that wonderful insight of Heidegger's, right? That Dasein presupposes Mitsein. The only way that human beings can live as humans is to be living with other humans. So one of the hugest pieces of cultural delusion, because we come back to this question, what aspects of the world of samsara are constructed individually, what aspects are constructed culturally. I want to forget that, because we function as individuals, as cultural pieces, and our cultures function as groups of individuals. Forget that duality. But think about this. It's that idea that we should grow up to stand on our own 2 feet. That what makes sense is my individual liberties. I've got to be autonomous. I've got to be authentic. I've got to be myself. And all of that first person singular bullshit that permeates the rhetoric that, in which we are marinated from the time that we're small enough large enough to understand language in the United States, generates an occlusion of Mitsein, and generates an occlusion of our relationality that is very, very, very serious. And so when we think about what insight can do for culture, a great deal of what insight can do for culture is to pay attention to that fiction and the facts that that fiction creates, and the fact that those facts are replaceable by far better novels we could write together. And I think a lot of what you were saying kind of underlines that. I just wanted to put a little bit more underlining on that. Yeah, I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Jay. I totally, yeah, we're certainly on the same page. I will say that I suppose you could say in a sense that part of what's happening is, in terms of cultural evolution, is that we need to evolve in the United States, that we have a kind of, cultural narrative that is clearly dysfunctional, and that we have inherited, and that we don't see in other places around the world. And it's gotta, that story's gotta change. We need, as you say, we need to write a new novel together.
There's another little point one could make here, and it's one that Hume makes very eloquently, that normativity arises out of custom, right? We start with customs of ways of doing things. Then we treat those ways as things we can expect of one another. John always visits me on Wednesday. It's Wednesday, he doesn't show up. I say, my God, something weird has happened. And I immediately say something wrong has happened. And we turn custom into norm. And it's sometimes worth pulling that back and trying to reverse that history and to recognize the customary origins of so much of what we take to be normative, and to recognize that those norms can be reworked by adopting different customs.
Thank you, Jay.
I saw Kalina had a quick, is there time for one last question from Kalina? Because I saw she had a question, and I'm very curious what it is.
Sure, go ahead, Kalina.
Well, I believe there's only 1 minute. So I have so much to say that I hope that in our panel in the afternoon, we each get a chance to present our reflections from our discussions. And it's impossible to do in that 1 minute that we have. But I actually, despite my absolute fascination with your talk, John, and I can't tell you how many things I want to talk to you about from that, and I loved in it, I actually wanted to strongly disagree with you and with Jay on the utility of labeling those things that you are labeling illusion, including the self-object duality, or including our sense of individuality. I don't think any of them are illusions. I think they're simply modes of functioning in our brain and in our mind. And they're simply being exaggerated currently by our culture and society. And the remedy is not to get rid of them, because they are one of the modes that we evolved to engage in. The remedy is to moderate them and facilitate the other modes that we function in as well, in order to build diversity. I think the notion of labeling them illusion is a bit like throwing the baby with the bathwater. It's actually a really important thing that we can do, and we must exercise that muscle along with all the other muscles that we have. And simply forcing it to atrophy will not lead to individual and society health. So it's a point that I would love to discuss with all of you in the afternoon panel discussion.
So I just very quickly say that the idea here is not to get rid of it. It's not to get rid of, that there are two things. One of them is that the kind of sense of self that comes with subject duality, like world, self, that there are things that are accreted to this, not just culturally. The Buddhists would even claim like part of the cognitive system, like a sense of agency and so on, that are actually not, like that sense of subjectivity is not actually an agent on this account, but it feels like it's an agent. So in that sense, there are some things that are, like classical illusions, but there are other things like a kinesis triangle. But you can't do without that kind of sense of self and world. So the idea is not to get rid of that. It's to have a different orientation or a different way of holding that makes it feel more contingent. So we may not be as quite apart in our opinion on this as it sounds, maybe.
Yeah, I wonder where ethics rests in this.
Yeah, can I jump in on that for 1 second and anticipate stuff we can talk about this afternoon? There's a really important distinction to be drawn between a self and a person.
Yeah.
And nothing that either John or I have said is meant to undermine the reality and the importance of persons,
Exactly.
nor individuality. The definition of an illusion in classical Indian philosophy is really beautiful. It's something whose mode of existence and whose mode of appearance are discordant, something that exists in one way and appears in another. And so one way to put this is that the illusion of the self is that real persons appear to us as unreal selves. And getting through that is, I think, extremely important. You can't be so nihilistic as to deny the existence of persons, but you can't reify persons and turn them into selves without significant moral implications.
Yeah.
So when we think about selves, for instance, we think of autonomous agent causers in this kind of Augustinian sense of freedom. And the moment we do that, our ethical thought becomes a discourse in terms of freedom and constraint, responsibility, guilt, blame, instead of thinking about human action in a framework of dependent origination that makes us look to the entire panoply of causes and determinants of behavior rather than what was in that person's mind when she did that terrible thing. And allows us to think about ethics and to think about ethical cultivation in a much richer way. And I think that selves really get in the way of that because that we get the baggage of autonomy and freedom and guilt and all of that
right.
stuff. Yeah.
So it's always a good sign when I get Jay going. It's always a good sign.
Well, it's a good sign when we all feel a lot of energy. And I think we have to be a little bit disciplined in terms of our time. Unfortunately, we're constrained by a pseudo reality. Al, I think it's important to say a few reflective comments, share a few reflective comments, and then we'll invite people into this afternoon's summary session. It's been a beautiful morning. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Roshi. Actually, some of the things I was going to say in connecting the dots have just been said in part by you, and the relationship to ethics, which I know we'll continue on with in the panel discussion. I also wanted to say that we're quite aware of all the number of questions that we don't explicitly get to. And there are some that we ran out of time for, particularly one coming from Brazil that I'll try to bring into the discussion this afternoon. But one of the things I hope that has emerged from these two presentations for everyone is a sense of how what we've been talking about in terms of awareness and particularly meta-awareness really has some important implications for the way in which we live with each other, the social dimension that John drew our attention to. So important. And the ethical dimension that Roshi, you draw our attention to. So hopefully those are elements we'll be able to continue with. We do resume this afternoon at 3 o'clock Mountain Time. And we'll begin with another guided meditation that I believe Richie is again being able to guide us with. So I look forward to something that is guaranteed to be quite rich and lively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Al. I'm going to invite the panelists to remain in the panel room, so to speak. We have just a few moments that we want to be together and to touch in, so we keep ourselves focused on this afternoon's content. And also immediately after that, a very short meeting with Al and John, Richie, and me. So thank you, everybody. And signing off for a short period of time. I hope you enjoy your lunch, and I hope you will take a walk and at least lift your eyes off that screen.